Friedrich Paulus was a German military officer whose name became inseparably linked to one of the most devastating battles in human history. His life traces a path from modest beginnings and steady professional advancement to a dramatic downfall that unfolded on the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Although he was once considered one of Germany's most capable staff officers, he became best known as the commander whose army was trapped, starved, and ultimately destroyed. His story is marked by ambition, duty, miscalculation, and the crushing consequences of loyalty to a regime that demanded victory at any cost. Paulus was born in 1890 in the town of Breitenau in central Germany. He did not come from a wealthy or noble family, and unlike many senior military figures of his era, he lacked aristocratic connections. His initial ambition was to pursue a legal career, but these plans soon gave way to his long-standing interest in military service. After being rejected by the Naval Academy, he joined a local infantry regiment as an officer cadet. This modest beginning was typical of his personality, conscientious, orderly, and determined. He quickly earned a reputation as a disciplined and precise soldier, traits that would guide his career throughout his life. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Paulus served on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Although he did not become a celebrated battlefield commander, he distinguished himself as dependable and methodical. He was eventually assigned to staff positions where his strong organizational skills were better used. The war shaped his thinking not through glory, but through exposure to the vast complexity of coordinating large military formations. By the time the conflict ended, Paulus had developed into a talented staff officer, and this would become the foundation of his future career. After the war, Germany's military was drastically reduced by treaty restrictions, and advancement was difficult. Despite this, Paulus remained in the army and gradually rose through the ranks during the 1920s and 1930s. He became known as a highly competent planner and thinker, even if he was not seen as a bold or imaginative field commander. His careful and polite manner contrasted sharply with many Nazi leaders, but his professionalism made him useful to them. When Adolf Hitler began rebuilding the German military, Paulus benefited from the rapid expansion. By the start of the Second World War, he was one of the army's most respected staff officers and had played an important role in preparing Germany's invasion plans. Paulus first gained major responsibility as deputy chief of the Army's Operations Department, where he assisted in developing Germany's early war strategy. In this role, he demonstrated an impressive command of detail and a skill for coordinating complex movements. His work contributed to the early successes in Poland, France, and the Balkans. Yet even as his reputation grew, there was an underlying contradiction. He excelled in planning but lacked experience in large-scale field command. This contradiction would become painfully important later. In early 1942, Paulus received a promotion that would define his life. He was given command of the German Sixth Army, one of the largest and most powerful formations on the Eastern Front. His mission was to lead the army in the summer offensive, aimed at capturing southern Russia's industrial regions and oil fields. The campaign progressed rapidly at first, and by late summer, the Sixth Army was approaching the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Capturing Stalingrad became a symbolic obsession for Hitler, who saw the city's name as a personal challenge. For Paulus, it was a vast and deadly undertaking. The battle that followed transformed Stalingrad into a nightmarish landscape of ruins, smoke, and constant close-quarters fighting. Paulus's army pushed deep into the city, but became bogged down in brutal street-to-street combat. German soldiers found themselves fighting inside shattered buildings, factories, and rubble-filled alleys. The Soviet defenders resisted tenaciously, and Paulus's methodical style was both a strength and a weakness. While he organized his forces carefully, he often hesitated to make bold decisions without explicit approval from his superiors. As a result, the battle dragged on for months. In November 1942, the situation changed dramatically. The Soviet Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive that encircled the entire Sixth Army. Within days, Paulus and more than 200,000 German and Allied troops were surrounded. Instead of withdrawing before the trap closed, Paulus had obeyed Hitler's order to hold the line. Now his army was compressed into a shrinking pocket and forced to endure bitter winter conditions with dwindling supplies. Hunger, cold, and disease spread rapidly. Paulus repeatedly requested permission to break out, but Hitler refused, insisting the army would be supplied from the air, a promise that quickly proved impossible. Paulus found himself leading a doomed force with no realistic chance of escape. As conditions deteriorated, Paulus faced an agonizing dilemma. He could disobey Hitler and attempt to break out, risking the collapse of his command structure, or he could continue obeying orders that condemned his army to destruction. His strict sense of duty, and his lifelong habit of following the chain of command, left him unable to defy the dictator. When the Soviets broke the German defenses in late January 1943, the situation became hopeless. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered the southern portion of the pocket, including his headquarters. A day later, the remaining northern troops also fell. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal just before the surrender, expecting him to kill himself rather than be captured, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus refused, later explaining that he saw suicide as dishonorable and pointless. In Soviet captivity, Paulus was initially withdrawn and depressed, haunted by the destruction of his army. But over time he shifted his position. He began cooperating with Soviet authorities and joined an anti-Nazi organization formed by German prisoners. He later provided testimony at the Nuremberg trials, describing Hitler's policies and criticizing the decisions that led to the catastrophe at Stalingrad. His cooperation earned him the hostility of many former German officers, but Paulus saw it as a moral obligation after witnessing the consequences of the war. Paulus remained in the Soviet Union for more than a decade after the war, living a restricted but relatively comfortable life. In 1953, he was allowed to move to East Germany, where he spent his remaining years in Dresden. He lived quietly, avoiding public attention, and wrote analyses of military history. Although he demonstrated regret about many of his wartime decisions, he continued to defend some of his conduct, explaining that he had acted within the limits of the rigid command system in which he had been trained. Friedrich Paulus died in 1957 at the age of 66. His legacy remains controversial. Some view him as a capable officer placed in an impossible situation, a man who was ultimately broken by his loyalty to a regime that demanded obedience above all else. Others criticize him for lacking the decisiveness and moral courage needed to defy catastrophic orders. What is undeniable is that his career reflects both the strengths and the deep flaws of the German military system in which he served. His life illuminates how discipline and technical skill can become dangerous when not balanced by independent judgment. Above all, his story stands as a reminder of the enormous human cost of decisions made by leaders under the pressures of war, and the tragic consequences when responsibility is surrendered to destructive authority.